Okay, so it's not often that you get to hear the actual poet perform their own poem, particularly with something that's considered to be a classic like W.H. Auden's As I Walked Out One Evening, but hopefully hearing him perform the poem gives you some more clarity. And before you go on to look at this close reading further down the pages for you, I would strongly suggest that it's worthwhile updating your initial reaction. Are there particular moments in the poem that stood out to you with Auden's reading? You might like to make a note next to them, but also just update and sort of review your own interpretation of the poem, because it is particularly worthwhile to think about how different readings of the poem affect you. And how rereading of the poem affects you. Was it clearer the second time, having it read to you, the difference in those voices? Was the buoyant nature of the lover's profession of the power of love to move and alter the world juxtaposed more clearly to the warning being offered by time that things aren't quite as idyllic as the lover suggests? Make sure you've tried to capture that before you do the close read. So remember, with poetry, we tend to do 3 readings. We read the poem for familiarity to begin with. We try and access, if we can, a more theatrical or more dramatic reading, in this case from Auden himself. You can find other versions of this poem being read. I think Sir Anthony Hopkins reads a version which is very good, but probably not really necessary. I think Auden's version is fine himself. And we read that for intonation and, I guess, clarity of emotion. And then the third reading should be this close reading. So that's what I want to talk about now. And I'm not going to read through this whole document with you. I think it's something that you really need to take your own time with and make some additional notes and perhaps utilize the annotation method and use some arrows to connect to the notes that I've made out to the side. So this is a very, very detailed breakdown of each stanza of this poem. You may notice some additional things, but I think that the things that I've pointed out will be more than you could possibly ever imagine that you might use in an essay. Where have I taken this information from? Just to be completely transparent, I have taken this from the website schmoop.com, which does a detailed breakdown of each stanza, and so many of the notes are edited versions of their notes. There's some that I have chosen not to include, and there's others of my own observation that I have noted. There's many things that I wouldn't have known on first reading and would have had to go to somewhere like Schmoop to find out, some references to antiquated texts and things that I didn't know about. So using those sorts of sites is very useful. But what I have done here is I've copied in this column here each stanza. So what I'd be doing is highlighting and annotating, using the pencil method of annotation to note words or phrases or language features that are particularly effective on this page here. And then you might indicate with an arrow the notation out to the side. So in this first one, I've said, notice the speaker refers to themselves. And so you might draw, just highlight that. You might connect the I here to the first notation just with an arrow. Now we would usually use the arrows to connect parts of the text to each other, and you can still do that if you find connections. For instance, the first voice is repeated then at the very end of the poem, or you might draw an arrow between the lover's voice and the clock voice, which is a response. So the arrow might be pointing back. Those sorts of things are still worthwhile, but I think connecting the comment, which is in the highlighting there, to where it's actually referring to in the poem is worthwhile. Okay. Notice here that it talks about the voices changing within the poem. Figurative language in the form of metaphor being used to describe people on the pavement. Well, where is that? Figurative language, this one is a metaphor. Metaphor, remember, is where the thing is described not to be like, but as if it actually is. So the people on the pavement were fields of harvest wheat. So this is the image. So you would put a little asterisk. You might put a little asterisk next to that, just like that. But you might just draw an arrow between those. Let me show you exactly what I mean, if I can manage to pull up an arrow here. So you might just, oops, didn't want to stay where it was, just to draw an arrow. Because you don't need to make the annotation. I've done the analysis of the image for you. Likewise, it says here, structurally you should notice that the second and fourth line of the stanza rhyme, and so street, I'm going to use highlighting instead of the square brackets, just because it's easier on the computer, but you might find that just putting the square brackets around is fine. So I've given you some technical language here. So each stanza is known as a quatrain. That's the particular style of rhyming. The rhyme in this first quatrain strengthens the link between the people and the metaphoric wheat. So that's the effect. So in terms of deconstruction or interpretation, we might be saying here that the speaker of the poem sees the people in a particular way. And how might we deconstruct that? Well, we might deconstruct the actual metaphor, but we also might deconstruct how the rhyming structure, the rhythmic structure of the poem actually reinforces that metaphor, highlights that metaphor. Okay, so you're going to work through the actually I'm going to just remove all those highlights there. You're going to work through each stanza, making sure you read the commentary out to the side and connect it to the stanza in the way that I have above, and move through. You'll see there is quite a lot. So you're doing this by hand so that you've got use of this in the SAC, and we'll have a very thorough and very, very highly developed understanding of the way that the language constructs meaning. Just a couple of extra things. At the end of the poem, I've talked about the meter. So it's very hard in the middle of the poem to talk about structures that happen throughout. So I just want to highlight that. As I said, some of this is taken directly from Shmoop, and they use a fairly casual tone of voice. So just to read this, WH was wicked smart is not the way that I would say it, and nor is it formal or the way I'd like you to say it in your discussion. This is straight off the Shmoop page. So this is talking about the rhyming pattern. So if you can remember your Shakespeare, he uses a similar, it has a similar effect. So certain words or syllables are placed in a particular order, so that the meter, that is the beat or the rhythm of the language, reinforces the way that you're meant to feel reading it. Okay, so look in the mirror, stand in the window, it was late in the evening. Those bolded phrases all have the same rhythm. So having those repeated words or stress words right next to each other, it imitates the tick-tock of the clock counting the passing of time. If they were iambic, that is the same as Shakespeare, so alternating unstressed and stressed syllables, it would be quite different. So the following line is iambic. The glacier knocks in the cupboard. The desert sighs in the bed. The cracks in the teacup opens, and the lane in the land of the dead. So that's iambic. That is a stressed and then unstressed. Sorry, an unstressed and then stressed syllable, and it's the same as a heartbeat. But they're also they're not pentameter. In that there's not 10 lines. There's what's called an anapestic. So there's a double unstressed beat towards the end of the line. And so it sounds, you might have detected it when we were reading it initially, like a bit of a nursery rhyme. But because the content is so dark, it makes it sound quite uncomfortable. So it's got a nursery rhyme film with a really dark message. Okay, so it says that it's unescapable. Even when we're young, we're moving towards death, is what's written there. And so these sort of general comments about the structure of the language are important. Okay, so that's the poem, and you can work through it now for the remainder of the session, but just to keep in mind that what you're doing eventually is forming an interpretation of your own. So I'd like you to do an interpretive map, but if you're finding it hard to get started, remember the interpretive map is writing your response to the poem after that close reading in the middle of an A4 page, and then sort of doing spider legs out to ideas around that. If you're stuck at all, you can certainly think about these perspectives. So I'm just going to read through them very quickly for you. So the first one is W.H. Auden suggests that man is separate from the natural world, and this limits his understanding of his place. That's what the clocks are warning us about, whereas the lover is suggesting that man can control the natural world. Or you could see a more critical reading. This is a bit more against perhaps what Auden is suggesting, but W.H. Auden incorrectly suggests that time is all-powerful. He neglects the role of religion and faith as being defences against the immutable passage of time. So this is someone taking a critical view of Auden and suggesting that he's misjudged the world. Number 3, the lover in the poem seems to feel that love offers intense possibility and power. W.H. Auden thus implies that if anything can overcome time, it is in fact love. So this is sort of taking the opposite view, perhaps, of the first one. And then number 4, in the poem, W.H. Auden portrays death as simply a fact of life. It's not something to fear or revere. It's just something to accept. So it's a pretty fatalist sort of view, but it is a view nonetheless. Now, what I want to say about those perspectives is you probably can't immediately attribute any one of those to one of the 6 theoretical perspectives that are up on our wall, or we talked about last week in class. That's because they're not written from one of those theoretical perspectives. They're written from just sort of people's own unique insight into the piece. You can understand, for instance, perspective number 2 is probably written by someone who is religious. So it has not a theoretical, say, Marxist or feminist underpinning, but it's actually written by someone who has faith. You might say prompt number 3 or perspective number 3 is written from a humanist point of view, someone who values and believes in the power of humanity to overcome things. And then prompt number 4 maybe from someone who's more pessimistic about the world, or I use the word fatalistic, someone who believes it's important we can't deny the fact that everything ends. So they have certain underpinning values, but they're not informed by one of those 6 theoretical perspectives that we've looked at. Feel free to use one of those if you agree with them as your interpretation, but I'd encourage you to use your own wording, because you'll perhaps explore or word it in a way that's easier for you to break down and discuss. So the purpose of today's class, remember, is just to have read closely the poem through those 3 stages, to have annotated it and be ready tomorrow to start to just plan out a discussion of your interpretation, identifying evidence and moments in the poem to discuss and pull apart in detail. Hope that's been helpful. These 2 videos have been useful. Work hard through the poem yourselves, and we'll see you tomorrow.